This is the worm bin that I recommend for schools. It can be of different sizes depending on the size of the school and the needs generated by the needs created by the amount of waste generated. But in principle it's the same. So this is a wooden box that's say typically 4 feet by 2 feet. That's 120 centimeters by 60 centimeters. There are holes drilled in the bottom of the box, and there's a lid. The lid is just to keep it nice and enclosed, to keep birds out, keep rodents out, and the holes drilled in the bottom are to allow excess moisture to drain out and also to allow a bit of air to come up from underneath. So with this design, what one would do is fill it up with brown materials, high carbon organic materials, which can be cardboard, shredded paper, newspaper, straw, hay, sawdust. What's really important is it needs to be moist. It needs to be soaked very well beforehand, because it needs to retain that moisture, and that keeps the worms healthy because they need to live in a moist environment. So if the entire contents of the bedding, as this is called, if the bedding is entirely moist, then the worms can easily live in it and do their thing. So we fill it up with brown material. For today's purposes, I'm using autumn leaves from last year, so they're nice and moist. I could even soak them more if I wanted, but these have been out in the rain for a while. They're very, very moist. So we fill the box up pretty much to the top with the brown materials, and this is fun for the kids and the teachers and whoever's involved. Just mixing everything, making a mess, soaking it all. So if you were using some of the other materials I mentioned, you might try to mix them all together first, the paper, cardboard, straw, just to create a kind of a uniform environment throughout the wormery. So I have my moist bedding, and then I need to add composting worms. So here are a couple of worms visible. They're what are called composting worms, or tiger worms, and they eat the food waste that we put in very, very rapidly. So typically, if you were using a 4 foot by 2 foot wooden box, as I mentioned, you'd probably put 1 or 2 kilograms of worms into the box to start with, but these won't be staying there, so this is just for illustration purposes. So I add my worms very quickly. They dive down away from the sunlight, and they start making their homes in the bedding, and then I can start feeding it. Now in the beginning I wouldn't feed too much, just give them a chance to settle in. They're not going to be eating too much at the start, but I can bring my fruit and vegetable waste from the school, my tea bags, and all of the other kind of compostable organic waste that a school generates, not counting garden waste. I wouldn't be putting grass cutting, certainly not, or probably not weeds into this. But I need to be a bit careful. If I just chuck stuff on top here, it's going to be smelly on top, there's going to be flies and so on. So I'm just using grass cuttings as an example because they're easy to handle at a small scale. So what I would do is I would bring my waste from the classroom, bring it out to the wormery, lift the lid of the wormery, and make a hole in the bedding and bury some of my food waste. If I have a lot of it, then I create a few different pockets, bury it, cover it over. And what's also useful is to keep a few sheets or a whole newspaper, some newspaper anyway, right on top of the whole thing. And this will stay moist, and it just creates a nice environment that the worms can come up near the top. But it's also an indicator. If the paper dries out, if the newspaper dries out, then the bedding beneath it is beginning to dry out, and I should water it with a hose sprinkler or a watering can. So I continue, day after day or week after week. I bury my food waste in different pockets, and the worms eat it all. And after a few weeks, then I can go back to where I started and just keep rotating through. The worms eat all of the food waste, but they also eat all of the bedding. So after several months, what will have happened is they will compost the contents. So after several months, the worms have eaten all of the food waste I've been putting in, but they've also eaten all of the bedding. So at this stage, the bedding has been decomposed, so the volume has gone way down in my worm bin. And the worms are now living in their own waste. You know, they eat food waste and bedding, and they convert it to compost through their bodies. So it's gone way down in volume. So I want to harvest this really, really nice compost, but I don't want to lose my worms in the process. I don't want to put them out in the garden. So what I do is I push everything over to one side. I put in fresh bedding on the other side. And for the next few weeks, I feed exclusively into the new side. The worms move over into the fresh bedding, fresh food, and what I can do then is dig out the finished compost from this side. The worms have all moved over. I've got an empty side. I fill it up with bedding, and now I've got a fully functional wormery again. So this is like usually 6 to 9 month rotation, so very, very easy to tie in with the school year, very educational. Go for it.